The mountain did not announce itself when they arrived. It never does. It simply waited, the way it always has, older than maps, older than names, older than the idea that humans passing through could ever truly belong to it. The morning air was thin and cool, the kind that fills the lungs too quickly and makes every breath feel sharper than usual. Fog clung to the lower slopes, drifting lazily between the trees, softening the edges of everything it touched. The trailhead sign stood quietly to one side, its paint faded from years of sun and snow, its warnings read so often they had become invisible. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out once, then fell silent, as if reconsidering whether sound was necessary here. They parked their car among only a handful of others. No crowds, no chatter, just a muted hush of a place that existed far beyond schedules and expectations. The engine clicked as it cooled, a small mechanical sound swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding forest. When they stepped out, gravel shifted beneath their boots, loud for just a moment, before the earth seemed to absorb even that. They were young, though not in the careless sense. Young in the way people are when they believe time is generous. When plans stretch comfortably into the future, without fear of interruption. Their movements were easy, familiar. He adjusted the straps of his backpack, checking them twice out of habit rather than concern. She tied her hair back, then untied it again, deciding she preferred the way it fell against her jacket. Small choices, ordinary gestures, the kinds of moments no one ever imagines could matter later. They stood for a second at the edge of the trail, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Not out of necessity, but instinct. He pointed toward the tree line, saying something quiet, maybe about how clear the weather was or how the fog would lift soon. She smiled in response, the kind of smile that didn't need words attached to it. There was laughter, too, brief and soft, quickly swallowed by the stillness around them. The forest ahead was dense but inviting, a corridor of towering pines and ancient firs that filtered the morning light into pale, shifting patterns. Sunbeams slipped to the canopy in narrow columns, illuminating drifting particles of mist and dust, making the air itself feel alive. The trail disappeared into that green depth, curving gently out of sight, promising distance without revealing where it led. They stepped forward together. At first, the hike was exactly what they expected. The ground was firm beneath their feet, packed down by years of hikers who had come and gone, leaving nothing behind but compressed soil and faint impressions. The incline was mild, almost forgiving. Their breathing settled into an easy rhythm, matched by the steady crunch of boots against earth and pine needles. Conversation flowed naturally, mundane topics, shared memories, thoughts about where they might stop for lunch. The future was discussed casually, without ceremony, as if it were already guaranteed. The mountain listened. As they moved deeper into trees, the sounds of the outside world faded completely. No distant traffic, no human voices, just the subtle symphony of the forest, wind moving through branches high above, the occasional snap of a twig underfoot, the far-off rush of water somewhere downslope. It was quiet, but not empty, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. They passed the first trail marker, without stopping. Bright paint against rough bark, reassuring in its simplicity, proof that they were exactly where they were supposed to be. She brushed her fingers against it as they walked by, the way people do without realizing why, grounding themselves in something solid. The fog began to thin as the sun climbed higher, but it never fully disappeared. Instead, it retreated upward, weaving itself between trunks and branches, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, repeating patterns of trees and shadows that made distance hard to judge. What looked close was often far. What felt familiar subtly shifted the longer you looked at it. At one point, they stopped near a small clearing where fallen logs formed a rough, natural bench. He took out a water bottle, offering it to her before taking a sip himself. She leaned back against the trunk of a massive tree, its bark cool through her jacket. She tilted her head upward, squinting at the patches of sky visible through the canopy. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. It was the kind of statement that didn't demand agreement. Beauty here was undeniable. But beauty in places like this carries weight. It presses in gently, reminding you how small you are without ever saying out loud. They lingered longer than they planned, not because they were tired, but because time felt different here, less urgent, less structured. When they finally stood again, brushing dirt from their hands, there was no sense of being behind schedule, no subtle anxiety urging them forward. The trail would wait. The mountain always did. As they continued upward, the path narrowed slightly. Roots pushed through the soil like veins, forcing them to watch their footing more carefully. He reached back once, steadying her over an uneven section without breaking stride. She squeezed his hand in response, a reflex so natural neither of them commented on it. The light shifted again as clouds passed overhead. Shadows lengthened, then softened. The temperature dipped just enough to be noticeable, raising goosebumps along exposed skin. She zipped her jacket higher, exhaling a small cloud of breath that vanished almost instantly. There was a moment, brief, easily missed, when the trail forked around a cluster of boulders. The markings were subtle, worn by time and weather. They slowed, exchanged a glance, and chose a direction without much discussion. Both paths appeared equally traveled, equally safe, equally ordinary. The forest did not correct them. Somewhere deep within the trees, a branch creaked and fell, the sound echoing longer than it should have. They both paused instinctively, listening. When nothing followed, they laughed it off, the tension dissolving as quickly as it had appeared. Wildlife, wind, the forest settling. Rational explanations came easily when nothing seemed wrong. They kept walking. The mountain watched them move farther from the trailhead, farther from the car, farther from the last place anyone would remember seeing them clearly. It watched as their voices blended into background sounds, becoming just another part of the landscape. It watched as their footprints pressed briefly into damp earth, only to begin fading almost immediately. By the time the fog thickened again, curling around their legs like slow-moving water, they no longer noticed it. They were too focused on the path ahead, on the quiet companionship between them, on the unspoken assumption that this day, like so many before it, would end exactly the way it was supposed to. They did not know that this mountain had seen countless others arrive with the same confidence, with the same laughter, with the same belief that nature was something to be visited, not something that could choose to keep you. And the mountain, as always, said nothing. Before the mountain became the last place anyone could point to and say that's where they were, they existed in 1,000 smaller places that had nothing to do with trees or trails or fog. They existed in kitchens where morning light spilled across countertops cluttered with coffee mugs and unopened mail, in cars with cracked dashboards and familiar radio stations, where arguments were resolved before the chorus ended, in living rooms where shoes were kicked off without thinking and jackets were draped over chairs instead of hung properly. Their lives were not cinematic. They were textured, uneven, and deeply ordinary. He grew up in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, even if they pretended not to. The kind of place where last names carried history, and childhood mistakes followed you longer than you expected. His parents kept the same house for decades, its paint color changing every few years, but its structure never shifting. He learned early how to be dependable, how to show up on time, how to fix things that broke, how to stay calm when others panicked. Friends described him as steady, not loud, not dramatic, someone who listened more than he spoke, who remembered details without making a show of it. She came from somewhere different, a place that felt louder, more crowded, always in motion. Her family moved often, chasing opportunities that never quite turned into stability. She learned adaptability instead of routine, learned how to make herself a home quickly and leave without ceremony. She laughed easily, spoke with her hands, and carried an energy that made rooms feel warmer. Where he was grounded, she was curious. Where he hesitated, she leaned forward. They met in a way that felt almost too simple to be meaningful. A shared obligation, a mutual friend who insisted, a conversation that lasted longer than expected. There was no moment either of them could later point to and say, that's when everything changed. It was more like a gradual alignment, two separate trajectories slowly bending toward each other until they overlapped. Their early days together were filled with small discoveries. How he took his coffee, black, no sugar, always too hot. How she hummed when she was focused, unaware she was doing it. They learned each other's silences, the difference between the quiet that meant comfort and the quiet that meant something was wrong. They argued, of course, but never explosively. Disagreements unfolded in low voices. Pauses stretched long enough to cool tempers. Resolutions reached without anyone needing to win. Friends noticed the way they moved together through spaces, not clinging but connected. The way they checked in with each other across rooms with nothing more than a look. The way plans were discussed as we instead of I. They weren't perfect, but they were intentional. The kind of couple people assume would last because nothing about them felt rushed. They talked about the future in pieces rather than declarations. A trip they want to take someday. A place they might live if the timing was right. Children, mentioned carefully, like something fragile you don't want to scare away by naming too loudly. There was no pressure, no ticking clock hanging over their conversations. Time still felt like an ally. The hike was not meant to be symbolic. It was an anniversary or a milestone. It was simply a free weekend and a shared desire to be somewhere quiet. He liked the predictability of trails, the sense of progress measured in distance and elevation. She liked the way nature disrupted her thoughts, how being somewhere vast made everyday worries feel smaller. Together, it felt balanced, safe. In the days leading up to it, life went on as usual. Work deadlines, a missed call from her sister that she planned to return later, a minor disagreement about whether they should leave early in the morning or sleep in a bit. Nothing unresolved, nothing dramatic. Their last text messages to friends were casual, their last emails mundane. No goodbyes were said with extra weight behind them. On the morning they left, his mother noticed the weather forecast and mentioned it might be colder at higher elevations. He waved it off with a smile, promising they had packed layers. Her roommate reminded her to bring a charger, just in case. She laughed, saying they wouldn't need it where they were going. These were final exchanges people would replay again and again, searching for meaning in words that were never meant to carry it. After they didn't return, those same people would sit with guilt they didn't earn, wondering if they should have insisted on a different trail, a different day, a different plan. Parents would replay phone calls in their minds, hearing pauses where none had existed before. Friends would reread messages, convinced they had missed a warning hidden between emojis and casual punctuation. But there had been no warning. Their lives up to that point offered no clues that this would be how they would be remembered. There was no pattern of recklessness, no history of disappearing acts, no desire to vanish. They were rooted in relationships, in responsibilities, in futures that were actively being built. That was what made the absence so loud. As days passed without answers, the people who loved them were forced to construct versions of them from memory alone. He became the son who always called when he said he would. She became the friend who never forgot birthdays. Their complexity flattened under the weight of longing. Flaws softened. Annoyances faded. They were preserved in the best light, froze at the age they had been when they walked into the forest. Their families gathered photographs, spreading them across tables like evidence of a life that had been undeniably real. Vacation snapshots, blurry, candid moments, smiles caught mid-laugh. Each image felt both comforting and cruel, proof that they had existed, proof that they were now unreachable. The mountain did not know any of this. It did not know their histories or the way their paths had intertwined. It did not care about the plans they had made or the people waiting for them to come home. But the way of all that unspoken context followed them into the trees, even if no one realized at the time. When the search would later begin, rescuers would be briefed on their physical descriptions, the clothes they had worn, the gear they carried. But those details were only the surface. Beneath them lay entire lives abruptly cut off from continuation, stories interrupted mid-sentence. They were not just two figures on a trail. They were the sum of countless moments that had led them there, moments that now existed only in memory, growing more fragile with every passing year. And that was the cruelest part. Not just that they vanished, but that everything they'd been before the mountain was now trapped in the past, unable to move forward, waiting endlessly for an ending that refused to arrive. By the time the trail began to change, neither of them noticed it happening. At first, it was nothing more than a subtle shift beneath their feet. The packed earth gave way to looser soil, scattered with fallen needles and damp leaves that softened each step. The incline grew steeper, though gradually enough that their breathing adjusted without complaint. The forest seemed to close in, not aggressively, but with quiet confidence, the trees standing closer together, as if narrowing the path by consensus rather than force. They walked side by side, occasionally falling into single file when the trail thinned. Conversation ebbed and flowed. There were long stretches where neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because silence felt appropriate here. When words did surface, they were light observations about the way the air smelled different, how the light seemed greener under the canopy, how time felt stretched, elastic. The trail markers appeared less frequently now. When they did, they were smaller, more weathered, paint-chipped, numbers barely legible. He slowed each time they passed one, glancing at it longer than before, mentally noting the distance covered. Not out of fear, just awareness. A responsible habit. She noticed but didn't comment. Trust filled the space between them. They stopped near a stream cutting across the trail, its water moving quickly over smooth stones, clear enough to reveal the pale shapes beneath the surface. The sound of it was calming, rhythmic. He crouched to refill a bottle, using a small filter, while she balanced on a rock, arms outstretched slightly for stability, laughing when her boot slipped and splashed. The laughter echoed oddly, bouncing off unseen surfaces before dissolving into forest. Beyond the stream, the trail angled sharply upward. Switchbacks carved into the slope led them higher, each turn offering a slightly different view of the same dense expanse. The temperature dropped again, subtle but unmistakable. She pulled her sleeves down over her hands, flexing her fingers to keep them warm. He adjusted his pace without being asked. There was a moment, small, easily overlooked, when she glanced back down the trail. Not because she felt lost, but because the forest behind them looked different than it had before. The path seemed narrower, more obscured, as if it had already begun to forget them. She shrugged off the thought and turned forward again. The idea lingered just long enough to feel strange, then disappeared. They passed another junction. This one was less clear than the last, the sign partially obscured by moss and lichen. The arrows pointed in two directions, their labels faded into near anonymity. He paused, pulling out the map they had folded and refolded so many times its creases were permanent. They compared it to the terrain around them, tracing lines with gloved fingers. After a brief discussion, they chose a path that seemed to match their intended route. Neither of them noticed the way the forest grew quieter after that. Not silent, never silent, but muted. The bird song that had punctuated their earlier steps faded into the background. The wind softened, its movement less obvious. Even the crunch of their boots seemed dampened, as if the ground itself were absorbing sound. Their voices lowered instinctively, though neither could have said why. Time became harder to measure. The sun was still visible in fragments overhead, but its position no longer offered clear guidance. Shadows stretched and shifted in unfamiliar ways, creating the impression of movement at the edges of vision. She shook her head once, as if clearing it, and joked about needing more coffee. He smiled, but his eyes lingered on the trail ahead a moment longer than before. They took a break on a fallen log, sharing a granola bar split cleanly down the middle. He checked his watch, then his phone, more out of habit than concern. No signal, not unexpected. She leaned back, resting her head against his shoulder, closing her eyes for just a second. The forest smelled rich here, earthy, damp, alive in a way that felt almost heavy. When they stood again, there was a faint sense of disorientation. The trail ahead looked similar to the one behind them. The trees repeated themselves with uncanny precision, trunks rising straight and tall, branches interlocking overhead. He hesitated, scanning for familiar markers. The log they had sat on blended seamlessly into the others scattered throughout the area. "It's fine," she said lightly, sensing the pause. "We're good." He nodded, trusting both the map and his instincts. They continued. The ground grew rockier, forcing them to slow. Loose stones shifted underfoot, sending small slides of gravel downhill with soft, cascading sounds. He reached out again when the footing became uneven, steadying her, guiding her steps. Their connection grounded them, anchoring them in a landscape that increasingly felt indifferent. The weather began to change without announcement. Clouds thickened overhead, dulling the light. A cool breeze threaded through the trees, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. She zipped her jacket higher, tucking her chin into the collar. He glanced upward, gauging the sky through the lattice of branches. They discussed turning back, not urgently, just as a possibility. The conversation was brief, measured. They weighed distance against daylight, comfort against curiosity. Ultimately, they decided to go a little farther, just to the next marker, just to see what was ahead. The next marker took longer to find than expected. When they finally saw it, it was partially hidden behind a curtain of vines, its surface nearly consumed by moss. He brushed it clean with his glove, revealing numbers that made his brow furrow. They didn't align with what he remembered. He checked the map again, tracing the route more carefully this time. She watched him, the easy confidence in her posture shifting slightly, not into fear, but into alertness, the kind that tightens the chest just enough to sharpen the senses. "Did we miss something?" she asked. "Maybe," he replied, noncommittal. "Or the map's outdated." They stood there longer than they had at any other point, the forest pressing in around them. The quiet felt heavier now, less like peace and more like expectation. Somewhere, far off, something moved, branches brushing, leaves rustling, but the source remained unseen. They chose a direction and moved on. As they walked, the trail became less defined, the boundary between path and forest blurring. Underbrush crept closer. Fallen branches forced small detours. Each step required more attention than the last. Conversation dwindled, replaced by the shared focus of navigation and footing. They were no longer just hiking. They were searching for markers, for confirmation, for reassurance that they were still exactly where they thought they were. Neither of them said it out loud, but the understanding settled quietly between them. This was no longer the hike they had planned. It was something else now, something slower, more deliberate, a journey that seemed to stretch ahead without offering a clear sense of how it would end. And as they moved deeper into the mountain, the trail they had followed so confidently behind them began, piece by piece, to disappear. The first sign that something was wrong arrived quietly, the way most disasters do. It came in the form of time, slipping past expectations without explanation. The afternoon crept forward, shadows lengthening across the forest floor, while the trailhead remained empty. The car sat exactly where it had been left that morning, untouched, its windshield catching the fading light. At first, no one worried. Hikes ran long all the time. Plans changed. People misjudged daylight. But as evening approached, concern began to take shape. A phone buzzed on a kitchen counter miles away, lighting up the dim room with a missed call notification. Then another, and another. Messages were sent casually at first, checking in, asking how the hike was going, joking about sore legs and late dinners. When no reply came, the tone shifted subtly but unmistakably. Questions replaced comments. Smiley faces disappeared. By nightfall, the worry had hardened into something heavier. Family members gathered around glowing screens, refreshing maps, rereading trail descriptions, calculating distances they had never cared about before. Someone pointed out that the sun set earlier at higher elevations. Someone else mentioned the weather forecast again, this time with less certainty in their voice. No one said the word missing yet. It hovered unspoken in the air, waiting. When the call was finally made, to park services, to local authorities, it was done with apologetic hesitation, as if calling too early might be an overreaction, as if restraint could somehow keep reality from forming. The response was calm, practiced. Names were taken, descriptions recorded. The last confirmed location, the trailhead, the car, the time, was logged with professional efficiency. The assurance came easily. Hikers often underestimated time. Search and rescue would check in the morning if they hadn't returned by then. Morning came, indifferent to fear. Sunlight spilled over the mountain, illuminating a landscape that looked unchanged from the day before. Dew clung to leaves. The forest stood quietly, offering no sign that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. But at the trailhead, the presence of the unmoved car now felt accusatory. Proof that someone had gone in and not come out. The search began in earnest. Rescue teams moved with urgency born from experience. They followed established protocols, dividing the area into sectors, assigning ground teams and aerial support. Radios crackled with coordinates and updates, voices clipped but focused. Volunteers arrived, locals, seasoned hikers, people who simply couldn't stay home knowing someone might be lost in those woods. They called out names as they moved, voices echoing through valleys and up slopes, carried briefly before being swallowed by distance. Each unanswered call deepened the unease. Dogs were brought in, their handlers watching carefully for any change in behavior. Helicopters traced slow, methodical pads overhead, scanning for movement, for color, for anything that didn't belong. The mountain offered nothing. No discarded gear. No footprints that led somewhere unexpected. No broken branches, signaling a fall. The trail looked exactly as it should, worn, continuous, deceptively normal. If anything, the forest seemed to resist scrutiny, its uniformity making every direction look plausible and wrong at the same time. As hours turned into days, the search expanded. Crews pushed farther from the last known point, venturing into steeper terrain, denser undergrowth. They checked ravines and stream beds, places where accidents often happened. Each area clear was marked off, the growing map of search zones offering both progress and dread. The more ground they covered without finding anything, the smaller the margin for hope became. Families were kept at a distance, close enough to receive updates, far enough to be protected from the physical toll of the search. They stood together in borrowed jackets and folding chairs, clinging to coffee cups that went cold untouched. Every approaching figure sparked a brief surge of expectation. Every neutral expression deflated it again. They listened to explanations about probability and survival rates, about exposure and injury. They nodded, absorbing information that felt unreal, disconnected from the people they knew. The couple they were waiting for didn't belong in these conversations. Those statistics applied to others, to strangers. At night, the search did not stop, but it slowed. Floodlights illuminated small patches of ground, harsh and unnatural against the darkness. The forest beyond those circles remained impenetrable, absorbing light without reflection. Sounds carried strangely after dark, distorted by fatigue and fear. Every snap of a branch, every distant rustle, set nerves on edge. Sleep came in fragments. When it came at all, by the third day, the tone shifted again. Hope remained, but it was no longer uncomplicated. Conversations grew quieter. Updates were delivered more carefully, with an awareness of how much each word mattered. The possibility that the couple had left the trail intentionally was discussed. So was the chance of an injury that prevented movement. Scenarios multiplied, each one more unsettling than the last. Still, nothing was found. The dogs lost a scent. Weather began to interfere, rain softening the ground, erasing what little trace might have remained. Helicopters were grounded intermittently by low visibility. Time worked relentlessly against the search, stretching resources thinner with each passing hour. Volunteers cycled out, replaced by fresh faces carrying the same determined expressions. Some cried quietly when they returned from their assigned sectors, the weight of failure settling in their chests. Others grew frustrated, convinced something had been missed, that the answer was just beyond reach if only they looked in the right place. The mountain remained unchanged. By the end of the first week, the search scaled back, not because anyone believed the couple had vanished into nothing, but because logic demanded limits. Every decision was framed as temporary, every pause described as strategic, but the language of hope had shifted, its edges dulled by reality. The families were asked to provide dental records, fingerprints, information that no one ever expects to be relevant. Each request landed like a small betrayal, a step toward an outcome they refused to accept. Press attention arrived, brief and intense. Cameras captured images of the trailhead, the search teams, the waiting families. Headlines used words like mysterious and unexplained. Strangers offered theories with uncomfortable ease. advice, speculation, sympathy that felt both generous and invasive. Then, gradually, the cameras left. When the official search ended, it did so without ceremony. There was no announcement that hope was gone, only a quiet acknowledgement that all reasonable efforts had been exhausted. The mountain had been examined, questioned, pleaded with. It had not responded. What remained was a silence heavier than the one that had existed before, a silence filled with questions that had nowhere to go. The trail reopened. Hikers returned. Life, in its unrelenting way, resumed its routines. But for those waiting, time fractured. Every phone call became a moment of suspended breath. Every knock at the door carried the potential to change everything. They lived in the space between outcomes, unable to move forward, unable to turn back. Somewhere within that vast forest, the couple's final moments remained sealed, untouched by search grids, untouched by human understanding. And the mountain, which had watched them arrive without acknowledgement, continued to stand in quiet defiance, keeping its secrets buried beneath layers of earth, shadow, and time. When the search ended, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like an absence where action used to be. The final day arrived without ceremony. No sirens, no gathered crowd. Just a gradual thinning of movement around the trailhead. Trucks pulled away one by one. Radios went quiet. The maps that had once been covered in colored markings, grids, paths, cleared zones, were folded and put away. What had been a living operation became a closed file, reduced to paperwork and unresolved questions. Officially, nothing had been found. Unofficially, that nothing began to feel like something of its own. Investigators reviewed the facts repeatedly, hoping repetition might reveal what logic had missed. The car had been parked correctly, not hastily. There was no sign of struggle at the trailhead, no evidence of a third party. The couple had been experienced enough hikers to understand basic trail safety. Weather conditions, while changing, had not been extreme. Everything about the case suggested normalcy, right up until the point where normalcy stopped. That was the problem. There were no torn backpacks lodged in ravines, no scraps of clothing caught on branches, no drop phones lighting up the forest floor at night, no footprints leading decisively off-trail. Even accidents tend to leave behind a story written in broken details. This disappearance offered no such narrative. It was as if the mountain had erased the moment they crossed an invisible threshold. Search leaders spoke carefully when pressed. They emphasized how vast the terrain was, how dense the forest could be, how quickly conditions changed. They used words like unlikely and statistically rare and unprecedented, never impossible. The families clung to that distinction, turning it over like a fragile object that might break if examined too closely. Privately, theories multiplied. Perhaps they had taken an unmarked path, confident it would reconnect later. Perhaps one of them had been injured, forcing the other to leave the trail in search of help. Perhaps fog had reduced visibility more than expected. Each scenario sounded reasonable in isolation. None explained the total absence of evidence. Volunteers who had combed the mountain replayed their own searches endlessly. They remembered areas that felt wrong, places where forests seemed unusually still, where the air felt heavier, where intuition whispered that something should have been there. They wondered if exhaustion had dulled their instincts, if they had walked past answers without recognizing them. Some returned on their own time, hiking the same routes again, slower now, eyes trained on the ground and the trees. They found nothing new, just the same endless repetition of trunks and shadows, the same deceptive sense that every direction looked familiar until it didn't. The families began to understand that the mountain was not going to give anything back willingly. Without physical proof, the disappearance existed in a strange limbo. Insurance claims stalled. Legal questions went unanswered. There was no death certificate to file, no formal closure to pursue. Birthdays passed. Holidays arrived and left behind empty chairs. Each milestone became a reminder not just of loss, but of uncertainty. They were asked, gently at first, whether they wanted to hold memorials, whether they wanted to mark time somehow. The question felt premature, almost offensive. A memorial implied an ending, an acceptance that they could not yet afford. So they waited. As weeks turned into months, The trail quietly reclaimed its routine. New hikers followed the same paths, unaware of the invisible weight beneath their feet. They stopped at the same stream, sat on the same fallen logs, took photographs in the same clearings. The forest offered them beauty without context, serenity without memory. Occasionally, someone would report seeing something unusual, a flash of color, a piece of fabric, a sound that didn't belong. Each report sparked renewed activity, a brief surge of hope that rippled through the families like electricity. And each time, the result was the same: false alarms, misidentified objects, the forest playing tricks on tired minds. The case files grew thicker, but not more informative. Notes repeated themselves. Dates blurred together. The disappearance became defined not by what was known, but by what stubbornly remained unknown. There was no moment when hope officially died. It thinned gradually, stretched so fine it became almost transparent. People stopped saying when they come back and started saying if, then, eventually, stopped saying either out loud. The mountain became a place spoken about in careful tones. Some avoided it entirely, unable to separate its beauty from what it had taken. Others were drawn to it obsessively, as if proximity might somehow coax answers from the soil. The landscape itself took on a personality in the collective imagination, aloof, withholding, quietly powerful. Investigators revisited the case periodically, prompted by anniversaries or new leadership. Each time, the same conclusion surfaced. Without new evidence, there was nowhere to go. The mountain had yielded everything it was going to yield, and that was nothing. What haunted those closest to the case was not just a lack of answers, but the precision of the absence. 2 people gone, with no disruption to the world around them. No sign of panic, no trace of suffering, just a clean, inexplicable removal. It challenged a belief that the world was legible, that causes led to effects, that events left behind explanations if you looked hard enough. This one did not. As years passed, the search became something people spoke about in the past tense. Back when they were still looking. Back when everyone thought something would turn up. The urgency faded from public memory, replaced by vague recollections and half-remembered details. But for those who loved them, the search never truly ended. It continued in dreams where footsteps echoed just out of sight, in moments of distraction, when they caught themselves listening for voices they knew would not answer, in the quiet conviction that somewhere something had been missed, not because of negligence, but because some truths resist discovery. The mountain stood unchanged through it all, weathering storms and seasons without acknowledgement. Snow fell where searchers once stood shoulder to shoulder. Leaves returned to ground, covering old footprints, smoothing over human presence. And beneath that layered silence, the unanswered question remained, unmoved, unmarked, waiting, not for discovery, just waiting. The town did not change all at once. It adjusted in increments, so small they were almost merciful. At first, everything felt suspended. Conversations paused when their names were mentioned, as if speaking too freely might somehow seal their fate. People lowered their voices instinctively near the trailhead, near the cafe where the couple used to sit by the window, near the grocery aisle where one of them had been seen just days before the hike. The disappearance sat heavy in the air, unnamed but constantly present. Then life, stubborn and unapologetic, began to push forward. The search trucks were replaced by familiar cars. The folding chairs disappeared from the edge of the parking lot. Flyers curled and yellowed on notice boards before quietly being taken down, one, by hands that didn't know whether removing them was an act of tidying or surrender. New posters went up in their place. Lost pets, community events, yard sales, paper evidence that time had not stopped for everyone. People went back to work. Children returned to school. Conversations drifted to safer topics. But beneath the surface, the absence remained, shaping behavior in ways that were subtle and enduring. The families learned quickly that grief without certainty behaves differently. There was no funeral to attend, no procession of cars, no shared ritual that signaled the world's permission to mourn. Instead, there was a constant state of waiting that never resolved into anything actionable. They lived with phones always charged, volumes always turned up, Minds always braced for interruption. Every unknown number triggered a physical reaction. Every knock at the door sent a shock through the chest before logic could intervene. Over time, the disappointment became harder to recover from than the hope itself. Friends struggled with what to say. Early on, they offered comfort with confidence, assurances that the couple would be found, that hikers turned up all the time, that miracles happened. Months later, those same friends fell quiet, unsure whether optimism now felt cruel. Silence replaced certainty, not out of indifference, but fear of saying the wrong thing. The couple's names began to shift in conversation. At first, they were spoken with urgency, always followed by updates, theories, possibilities. Later, they were mentioned more carefully, often in the past tense before being corrected. Eventually, they became a reference point. That was before. That was around the time they disappeared. Their home changed too. Objects remained exactly where they had been left, then slowly began to feel out of place. Jackets hanging untouched by the door. Shoes still lined up beneath the bench. A half-finished project gathering dust in the corner. Each item carried weight far heavier than it deserved, becoming evidence of a life paused rather than ended. The families faced decisions no one prepares for, whether to keep rooms intact or repurpose them, whether to donate clothes or hold on to them, just in case, whether to celebrate birthdays that might never be acknowledged again. Each choice felt loaded, as if making the wrong one might somehow erase the possibility of return. In the wider town, stories began to solidify. New residents learned about the disappearance as a local legend, something mentioned casually, stripped of its emotional core. A couple went missing up there years ago, people would say, gesturing vaguely toward the mountain. The sentence often ended there, unfinished, as if details were unnecessary. Some hikers avoided the trail entirely after that. Others sought it out, driven by a morbid curiosity they didn't fully understand. They took photos in the same places, unaware or unconcerned that they were standing where searchers once stood, calling out names that never echoed back. The mountain became a boundary, not just a geography, but a memory. For those who lived nearby, it marked a before and after. For everyone else, it remained just another backdrop. Beautiful, indifferent, untouched by the stories layered beneath its surface. Years passed in this uneasy equilibrium. Anniversaries arrived with quiet dread. The families marked them privately at first, lighting candles, taking solitary walks, revisiting old messages and photographs. Later, they stopped marking them altogether, not because the pain had lessened, but because acknowledging the passage of time felt like admitting defeat. The town learned how to speak around the absence rather than about it. Teachers avoided mentioning it in class. Local news referenced it only in passing, if at all. It became a shared silence, maintained out of respect, discomfort, and fatigue. But silence does not mean forgetting. Every so often, something would stir it back to life. A hiker claiming to have heard voices. A piece of gear found miles away that turned out to belong to someone else. A documentary crew calling with questions, promising renewed attention. Each instance reopened wounds that had never truly healed, reminding everyone how thin the layer of acceptance really was. The families aged in visible ways. Lines deepened around eyes that had learned to scan crowds unconsciously. Hair grayed while waiting rooms and unanswered emails piled up. Their grief matured, settling into something quieter but no less heavy. It became part of their identity, woven into introductions and explanations. My son went missing. My sister never came back. They learned to carry that sentence with them everywhere. In the town, new stories took precedence. New emergencies demanded attention. New tragedies replaced old ones in the collective consciousness. The disappearance became a footnote, a chapter closed not by answers, but by exhaustion. Yet the mountain remained unchanged, looming at the edge of daily life. It watched the season cycled, as trees grew taller, as trails were rerouted and signs replaced. It held its silence with remarkable consistency, offering no hint that it remembered anything at all. For those who loved the couple, that was perhaps the hardest part. Not that the world moved on, but that it did so completely. That life continued to assert itself, demanding participation, while they remained anchored to a moment that never resolved. They learn how to live with the unanswered question, not by accepting it, but by making room for it, by building routines around the absence, by carrying hope and despair side by side, neither one fully winning. The town, in its quiet way, learned the same lesson. Some stories do not conclude. They simply fade into the background, shaping the space around them long after the last word has been spoken. The case refused to stay buried. No matter how carefully it was filed away, it resurfaced in fragments at first, an offhand mention in a conversation, a footnote in an unrelated report, a name recognized too quickly by someone who thought they had forgotten it. Time had dulled the urgency, but it had not erased the unease. The disappearance lingered in the margins, waiting for the right conditions to be noticed again. Those conditions arrived quietly, without fanfare. A new investigator took over a desk that had belonged to someone else. Boxes were shifted. Old files were opened simply to be organized, their contents reviewed with fresh eyes that had not yet learned which questions were considered unanswerable. The couple's names appeared on a list of unresolved cases, unremarkable at first glance. Just 2 more entries among many. But the more the investigator read, the stranger it felt. There were too many blanks, too few contradictions. The reports were thorough, careful, almost clinical, but beneath the professionalism was a current of frustration that hadn't fully faded. Notes in the margins hinted at uncertainty, at moments where instinct had clashed with procedure and lost. The investigator traced the timeline again. Arrival at the trailhead, estimated route, weather conditions, search parameters. Everything aligned neatly, and yet the outcome defied explanation. No matter how many times the facts were rearranged, they produced the same silence. Curiosity hardened into fixation. Maps were spread across a desk, layered with transparent sheets marking search zones, elevation changes, and potential deviations. The terrain was studied not as a whole, but as a series of decisions. Places where someone might have hesitated, turned back, chosen wrong without realizing it. The mountain became less a landmark and more a puzzle, its vastness broken down into manageable questions. Others were drawn back into the orbit as well. A journalist, long fascinated by unresolved disappearances, stumbled across the case while researching something else. The lack of resolution bothered her. So did the absence of spectacle. There was no scandal to explain away the mystery, no villain to hold accountable. Just 2 people and a landscape that refused to tell its story. She requested the files, asked for interviews, called family members who had learned to recognize the tone of renewed interest, the careful balance between empathy and ambition. Some declined. Others agreed, hopeful despite themselves that attention might bring answers. Memories were pulled back into the light, dusted off and re-examined. Family members recalled small details they hadn't thought mattered before. A comment made in passing, a hesitation on the trail, a choice that now felt heavier in retrospect. Each recollection carried the risk of rewriting the past, but they shared them anyway, aware that silence had not served them well. The investigator returned to the mountain, not as part of a search, but as an observer, alone, without radios or helicopters, without the pressure of expectation. He walked sections of the trail at different times of day, noting how light shifted, how visibility changed with weather, how easily sound disappeared into the forest. He paid attention to places that felt misleading, clearings that looked like junctions, paths that appeared intentional but led nowhere. He noticed how easy it was to underestimate distance, how quickly landmarks repeated themselves, how confidence could persist long after it should have given way to caution. Something about the trees bothered him, not in a dramatic sense. There was no obvious threat, no looming danger, but certain areas felt wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. The forest canopy thickened in places, obscuring the sky completely. In others, the ground dipped unexpectedly, hiding small ravines beneath layers of brush. It was easy to imagine stepping just a little too far one side and losing the trail without realizing it. Still, that didn't explain everything. The journalist uncovered old tips that had gone nowhere at the time, reports dismissed as unreliable, sightings that couldn't be verified. One in particular stood out, a hiker who claimed, years earlier, to have seen something unusual high above the trail, partially obscured by branches. The report had been vague, lacking context, and had been quietly set aside. At the time, it had sounded impossible. Now, with distance from the initial chaos, it felt less so. The investigator and the journalist compared notes cautiously at first. Neither wanted to believe they had found something meaningful too quickly. Experience had taught them that hope could distort perception. But patterns began to emerge, not definitive answers, but questions that hadn't been asked loudly enough before. Why had certain areas been searched more thoroughly than others? Why had the focus remained almost entirely on the ground? Why had the assumption persisted that if something was missed, it would be below eye level? They revisited old photographs taken during the search. Wide shots meant to document progress rather than capture detail. Enlarged and examined years later, the images revealed little, but they also revealed how much had been overlooked simply because no one had thought to look that way. The case was reopened quietly. There was no public announcement, no press release, just a shift in attention, a reallocation of time and resources. A few carefully chosen areas were marked for further examination, not because evidence demanded it, but because intuition did. The families were notified with caution. Hope was offered carefully, wrapped in disclaimers and realistic expectations. They listened with practiced restraint, hearts aching at the familiar rhythm of anticipation and doubt. They had been here before. The mountain was approached differently this time, not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a structure to be understood. Specialists were consulted. Environmental changes over the past decades were considered. Tree growth, erosion, storms that could have altered the landscape in subtle but significant ways. What had once been impossible to see might now be closer to the surface. The investigator spent hours standing still, looking up, branches interlocked overhead, forming a dense lattice that filtered light and obscured depth perception. From the ground, it was difficult to tell how high something was, or how it might have arrived there. Perspective played tricks. Distance collapsed and expanded unpredictably. The journalist documented everything, careful not to impose meaning too soon. She wrote about the weight of unresolved stories, about how time doesn't erase mystery but refines it. Her audience responded, not with theories, but with recognition. People knew this feeling, the discomfort of questions that refused to settle. As attention returned to the case, the town felt the shift almost imperceptibly. Old conversations resurfaced. Names were spoken again, tentatively. A sense of something unfinished crept back into daily life, stirring emotions that had learned how to lie dormant. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The case had never truly closed. It had only been waiting for the right moment, the right eyes, the right willingness to admit that certainty had been an illusion all along. And somewhere within the forest, whatever truth remained had not gone anywhere. It had simply been waiting to be seen differently. 25 years passed without asking permission. They moved through the town quietly, stacking themselves into decades-away rings formed inside a tree, visible only if someone stops long enough to look. Streets were widened. Stores changed hands. Familiar faces thinned out, replaced by new ones who learned the layout of the place without ever learning its deepest story. The mountain did not age the same way. Its outline against the sky remained constant, a dark, familiar shape that anchored the horizon. Seasons continued to cycle across it with mechanical precision, snow settling into its crevices each winter, melting into streams that traced the same paths they always had. Trees grew taller, thicker, their branches stretching into spaces that had once been open. Whatever the forest had witnessed, it carried without effort. The couple existed now mostly in memory, their faces preserved in photographs that never changed. They remained young, while everyone else grew older around them. In family albums, their images became time markers, before marriages, before births, before losses that would come later. Life went on, but it went on around them. The families learned how to speak about them in careful tones. Their names were no longer followed by explanations, just quiet acknowledgments. The initial urgency had softened into something heavier and more permanent. Grief had settled into the background, no longer loud but always present, influencing decisions in ways that were rarely articulated. Birthdays were still remembered, though sometimes only internally, a passing thought, a pause in the middle of an otherwise ordinary day. The question never stopped forming. How old would they be now? Even though the answer no longer felt useful. Technology changed everything except the outcome. Search tools became more advanced. Mapping software grew more precise. Drones replaced helicopters in many areas. Data could be layered and analyzed in ways that once seemed impossible. And yet, none of it altered the fundamental reality of the case. The mountain had not yielded answers when it was searched by hundreds of people, and it did not offer them up easily now. Every few years, the case resurfaced briefly. A podcast episode, a short article, a forum thread filled with speculation from people who had never been there, who treated the disappearance like a puzzle rather than a wound. Each resurgence brought a wave of attention that rose and fell quickly, leaving behind only exhaustion for those closest to it. The families learned to recognize these cycles. They learned when to engage and when to step back. Hope, once limitless, had become something to be rationed carefully. The town carried the story differently now. It was no longer spoken about with fear, but with a kind of reverence, a reminder of vulnerability, a quiet lesson passed down without ceremony. Parents warned their children to stay on marked trails, to respect the wilderness, to understand that familiarity did not equal control. Hikers continued to visit, unaware of how many feet had followed the same path before them, how many questions lay buried beneath their boots. They took photographs, breathed in the silence, and left without ever knowing what the mountain had once refused to return. The forest itself changed in ways that only time could accomplish. Branches thickened. Underbrush reclaimed areas once trampled by searchers. Trails shifted subtly as water redirected soil, and roots pushed upward. What had once been visible became obscured. What had once been inaccessible became, slowly, reachable. This slow transformation was not dramatic. It was patient, relentless. For investigators revisiting the case decades later, the challenge was no longer just about finding answers. It was about understanding how much the landscape itself had rewritten the conditions of the disappearance. Old coordinates no longer aligned perfectly. Reference points had vanished. The mountain had moved, not in space, but in structure. The absence of certainty had shaped lives in ways no one could have predicted. One parent retired earlier than planned, unable to focus on a career that suddenly felt irrelevant. A sibling moved away, unable to remain in a place where every familiar corner carried echoes of what was lost. Relationships were tested by grief that had no outlet, no shared endpoint, and still no ending arrived. The couple's story became a kind of emotional landmark, a fixed point against which other losses were measured. When something went wrong in the community, a fatal accident, a sudden illness, people referenced the disappearance without saying it directly. At least there's closure, someone might whisper, immediately regretting the comparison. Because closure, it turned out, was not a guarantee. It was a privilege. The mountain loomed over all of this, indifferent to anniversaries and remembrance. It had no sense of time beyond cycles of growth and decay. To it, 25 years was nothing, a moment, a blink. But for those who had waited, those years stretched impossibly long. They watched as the world reinvented itself, as new tragedies replaced old ones in the public consciousness, as language shifted and attention spans shortened and unresolved stories became content rather than lived experiences. The families adapted. They learned how to talk about the disappearance without breaking down. They learned how to answer questions from people who asked out of curiosity rather than concern. They learned how to live with the understanding that some truths might never arrive. Yet even after 25 years, the silence never felt complete. There was always a sense, quiet, persistent, that something remained unsettled, that the mountain had not finished with the story, that the absence itself was not the final chapter. When investigators stood at the trailhead now, decades removed from the original search, they felt it too. The weight of time layered over unresolved questions. The awareness that the forest they were looking at was not the same forest the couple had entered. Whatever had happened was no longer just hidden. It was buried under years of growth, patience, and the slow rearrangement of the natural world. And yet buried things have a way of resurfacing, Not because they're called back, but because time eventually shifts enough for them to be seen again. The discovery did not announce itself with urgency. It arrived the way most truths do, quietly, almost apologetically, as if unsure whether it was welcome after so much time. It began with routine. A scheduled survey of the forest, part of a long-term environmental assessment meant to track tree health and canopy density. The work was methodical, unglamorous. Data points collected, measurements taken, notes scribbled onto clipboards and tablets. No one involved expected to intersect with a story that had outlived headlines and hope. The forest, on that day, looked ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the upper branches in fractured patterns, illuminating patches of moss and fern below. The air was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and sap. The team moved slowly, eyes trained upward and outward, scanning for signs of disease, damage, irregular growth. That was when someone noticed something that didn't belong. At first, it registered as a shape rather than an object, a disruption in the natural repetition of branches and leaves. The human eye, trained over millennia to detect pattern breaks, lingered on it longer than it should have. It was high above the forest floor, nestled among interwoven limbs where nothing manufactured should exist. The surveyor stopped walking. From below, it was difficult to identify. Distance collapsed details. Perspective distorted scale. It could have been debris carried by a storm, a piece of old equipment forgotten by hikers, or nothing at all, just shadow arranged in a convincing way. But the longer they looked, the harder it was to dismiss. The shape was elongated, too symmetrical, too deliberate. It hung at an angle that suggested placement rather than accident. Surrounding branches had grown around it, not through it, as if accommodating its presence rather than resisting it. The team exchanged glances, the unspoken understanding settling in quickly. This was not part of their assignment, but it was no longer something they could ignore. Binoculars were raised, focus adjusted, the image sharpened just enough to remove doubt. What they saw was old, weathered, faded almost to the point of blending into the bark and lichen around it. Time had stripped it of color, softened its edges, but its origin was unmistakably human. Silence followed. No one spoke right away. There was a shared hesitation, born from a recognition that noticing something was one thing, but understanding its implications was another entirely. After decades of nothing, this single anomaly carried a weight far beyond its physical presence. The location was marked, coordinates recorded with careful precision. Photos were taken from multiple angles, though none captured the full clarity of what hung above them. From the ground, the object remained frustratingly out of reach, partially obscured by the canopy that had grown thicker with every passing year. Protocols were followed. Calls were made. Authorities were notified with the kind of language reserved for situations where certainty is still forming. The Forest Survey paused, its original purpose instantly irrelevant. News traveled quickly but quietly. Those who received the call understood immediately why it was being made. The mountain had been searched countless times. Every visible inch of ground had been examined, but this had existed in a space few had ever considered necessary to check. Within hours, specialists arrived, climbers with experience navigating difficult terrain, investigators who had spent years looking at maps and photographs, now standing beneath a truth that had been hiding in plain sight. They looked up. From this angle, the object appeared even more unsettling, not because of what it clearly was, but because of how long it had remained unseen. Branches cradled it, moss clung to it. Nature had not rejected it. It had accepted it, incorporated it, disguised it. No one rushed to conclusions. They knew better than to let the moment outrun the facts. But even restraint could not dull the sense that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in 25 years, the mountain had offered something tangible. Not an answer, not yet, but a contradiction to the idea that nothing had been there at all. The climb was slow and deliberate. Every movement was calculated. The tree, massive and ancient, resisted intrusion with quiet authority. As climbers ascended, branches creaked softly under weight that had not disturbed them in decades. Leaves brushed against equipment, releasing scents locked away by time. When they reached the object, They paused. Up close, its condition told a story of endurance. Sun-bleached, rain-soaked, frozen and thawed through countless winters. Whatever it was, it had been there for a long time, long enough for the forest to adapt around it. Carefully, they documented everything. Materials, positioning, signs of wear. Nothing was touched unnecessarily. This was not a moment for haste. Below, investigators waited, eyes trained upward, aware that they were witnessing a turning point. Not because everything was about to make sense, but because the silence that had defined the case had finally been broken. Word reached the families with extreme caution. There was no celebration in the delivery of the news. No attempt to soften it with optimism, just a careful explanation. Something had been found. It was too early to know what it meant, but it existed. For some, that was enough to reopen wounds they had spent decades learning to live with. For others, it felt like validation, that their waiting had not been for nothing, that the mountain had not swallowed the truth entirely. The discovery did not solve the mystery, but it changed its shape. After 25 years of emptiness, the forest had revealed a single, disturbing anomaly, one that suggested not chaos, but intention, not randomness, but placement. And as investigators began the slow work of understanding how and why it had remained hidden for so long, one thing became impossible to deny. The mountain had not been empty. It had been keeping something. Not because of distance, but because of hesitation. Every movement upward felt like crossing an invisible boundary, one that had held for decades. The forest resisted gently, branches interlacing, roots tightening around the base of the tree, as if aware that something long hidden was about to be disturbed. Specialists moved carefully, more deliberate than urgent. There was no rush now. Whatever answers this object carried had waited 25 years. Another hour would not change its meaning. As they climbed, the scale of the discovery became clearer. What had looked small from the ground revealed itself as something unmistakably personal. Fabric that once had structure. Seams that spoke of human design. The remains of an item meant to be worn, not lost. It had been pulled into the tree's embrace slowly. Over years, branches thickening around it, bark growing close without fully consuming it. The forest had not preserved it out of kindness. It had preserved it through indifference. When it was finally freed, lowered gently back to the ground, the weight of it was not physical. It was symbolic. This was not debris. This was not coincidence. This was proof, not of what had happened, but of where assumptions had failed. For decades, the search had focused downward. Ravines, slopes, stream beds. The logic had been sound, built on patterns and precedent. People fall, people descend. Gravity pulls everything toward the ground. But the mountain had kept part of the story above eye level. Investigators examined the item without spectacle. There was no dramatic reveal, no instant clarity. Time had stripped it of obvious identifiers, but not of implication. Weathering told its own story. Years of exposure, of stillness, of being untouched by human hands. This was not something that had arrived recently. It had been there while seasons passed unnoticed beneath it. Questions multiplied instead of resolving. How had it gotten there? Not simply how it ended up in the tree, but how it remained undiscovered for so long. Why had it not fallen? Why had no one seen it during the original searches, when helicopters passed overhead and volunteers scoured the forest floor below? The answer was uncomfortable in its simplicity. No one had been looking up. The forest canopy had been treated as background, as ceiling rather than space. The assumption that anything important would be found below had gone unchallenged. This discovery didn't just add a new piece to the puzzle. It reframed the entire picture. The mountain had not erased the couple completely. It had scattered the truth in a way that defied expectation. For the families, the revelation landed unevenly. There was relief in knowing that something tangible had finally surfaced, and pain in realizing how close it might have been all along, suspended above years of searching, grief, and unanswered prayers. This was not closure, but it was confirmation. Confirmation that the disappearance had not been imagined, that something real had occurred, that the silence had not been empty. It had been occupied, watching quietly from above. The trees, growing patiently around what they held, had not hidden the truth out of malice. They had simply grown. And in doing so, they had kept what the mountain was never ready to release. Until now. The discovery did not bring the kind of ending people expect from stories like this. There were no clear answers delivered in neat lines. No single explanation that made the past suddenly make sense. What emerged instead was something quieter and more complicated. A shift in understanding rather than a resolution. The families were given what information could be confirmed. Timelines adjusted. Assumptions reconsidered. The truth, such as it was, arrived in fragments, each one heavy in its own way. Knowing that something had been there all along, watching seasons pass from above, brought a strange mix of comfort and grief. It meant the mountain had not swallowed everything, but it also meant that certainty had always been closer than anyone realized. The town reacted with subdued recognition. There was no spectacle, no public reckoning, just a collective pause, a shared intake of breath as people absorbed what the discovery implied. Conversations resumed, softer now, more reflective. The story returned briefly to public awareness, framed not as a mystery solved, but as one partially illuminated. And then, slowly it settled again. The trail remained open. Hikers continued to come and go, unaware of how much history rests above and below their path. The forest did not mark the spot. No sign indicated what had been found there, or what questions it had raised. Nature rarely offers annotations. For the families, life continued in its altered form. The discovery did not undo years of waiting, but it changed the shape of that waiting. The question shifted from what happened to how much will we ever know. Grief adjusted itself once again, finding new edges, new boundaries. There was a sense, faint but present, that the mountain had finally exhaled, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. It had released a piece of the story when it was ready, on its own terms. The rest remained beyond reach, folded back into earth and memory. Time moved forward, as it always does. New stories took center stage. New absences demanded attention. But this one lingered differently now, no longer defined solely by disappearance, but by the strange persistence of what it endured. The trees continued to grow. Branches thickened where something once hung. Bark closed over old impressions. The forest reclaimed its symmetry, leaving no visible trace of the moment when truth briefly surfaced. To someone passing through, the place looked unchanged, peaceful, ordinary. And yet, for those who knew, the mountain felt altered, not because it had changed, but because it had revealed itself. It was no longer just a place where two people vanished. It was a reminder that not all stories are meant to be fully understood, that some answers arrive too late to heal, but too early to ignore, that the natural world does not operate on human timelines or needs. The couple's story did not end with certainty. It ended with resonance, a quiet understanding that some places remember everything, even when they appear to say nothing at all. ChatGPT can Mac.